Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. So let's start and welcome to this second presentation in our Ethics of Care series. Of course, care, a burning issue for the 21st century. The other day I heard somebody say, equating the issue of care, the fact that it's a burning issue to climate change. Maybe it's a bit melodramatic, but whatever. So care is an important issue to be discussed. Professor Virginia Held is one of the pioneers of the field in ethics of care, and she will deal with a core issue of care and justice and its implications for social, political, legal, and global issues. Virginia Held is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the City University of New York and Professor Emerita at Hunter College. And her main work in this field is the ethics of care, personal, political, and global, feminist morality, transforming culture, society, and politics. It was published by Oxford University Press. Her most recent article was on morality, care, and international law in the Ethics and Global Politics Journal. So, Professor Held, we look forward to listening to you. Care and justice in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to be here. And as you may know, the ethics of care was originally developed in contrast with the ethics of justice, but I'm going to try to talk about how they need to be integrated. I want that, yes, very much so. I've got this microphone, so The ethics of care is only a few decades old, a mere moment in the long history of theorizing about how we ought to live and to act. And yet, in this short time, this new moral approach has become a serious and influential alternative to the moral theories that have been dominant. The theories that have been dominant are Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and to a lesser extent, traditional virtue theory. The ethics of care represents an effort to overcome the gender bias that has long been built into the ways we theorize about morality in society, not just the ways we act within existing structures of thought and action. As it is developing, the ethics of care is becoming a comprehensive moral approach able to provide guidance for the full range of human relations, from our closest relations in contexts of family and friendship and small groups to our most distant relations in political, civil, and global society. A central question for the ethics of care is, how should we understand justice and care and the relation between them? From its beginnings, the ethics of care has been developed in contrast with the ethics of justice. I locate the beginnings of what I mean by the ethics of care in the early 1980s with Sarah Reddick's exploration of mothering and the thinking it involves, Nell Noddig's phenomenological account of caring, and Carol Gilligan's psychological accounts of different and gender-related interpretations of moral problems. I mean by the ethics of care the new feminist moral outlook and theory that have developed by paying attention to and recognizing the moral relevance and importance of previously discounted caring practices. These practices were very different from the legal and political ones that the dominant normative moral theories of Kantian ethics and utilitarian consequentialism seemed designed to guide. The dominant moral theories were concerned almost entirely with universal principles and rules, with impartial judgments, with rights and obligations, or with the interests of self versus the interests of all. Accompanying political theory focused on hypothetical contractual agreements, on universal rights, and on maximizing individual interests in a version of a marketplace. Questions about what we ought to do were to be answered by rational deduction from abstract rule to particular case, or rational calculation of costs and benefits. To motivate persons to act as they should, the dominant theories looked to rational recognition of, on the one hand, the categorical imperative, on the other, the principle of utility. The practices of care we started to pay attention to called for very different approaches and values. A mother taking care of a small child for whom she's responsible does not pit her own interests against those of the child, aiming to maximize her interests in competition with the child's, or, altruistically, her child's at her own expense. Although taking care of children is full of conflict, parents aim at the relation between themselves and their children being loving, trusting, and considerate. They aim at the well-being of their children along with themselves, at what would be best for them together, at their mutual interests, rather than at individual gain. They attend closely and receptively to the particular child for whom they're caring, responding to his particular needs with sensitivity and effectiveness. To evaluate whether a parent is caring well for a child, an evaluation must be made as much from the point of view of the child as of the parent. So when we're trying to say what would be good care, we can understand that it needs to be respectful to avoid being domineering. In deciding what to do when caring for a particular child, one relies rather little on universal rules and the rights and duties they imply. One focuses on the particular characteristics of the unique person in one's care, trying to understand her needs and responding to them. Certainly, empirical findings on beneficial and harmful effects, and they will be general findings, are extremely important, but they are seldom morally decisive. One fosters the trust between parent and child so central to a good relation. Rather than relying on rational recognition of the validity of a universal principle to motivate one's actions, one does what is needed because one cares for the child. One's emotions of empathy, sympathy, benevolence, and love motivate the often very burdensome labor of care. Sometimes, if caring emotions flag and one's actual emotions turn ugly, one may fall back on a sense of duty to keep going in a caring task. But one can recognize that this sense of duty is an inferior rather than a superior motive, contrary to Kantian assertions. Understanding the values in caring work and practices, we can cultivate and promote these values. We can extend them to others beyond the family. The domain of friendship has many similarities and calls for many similar values. So does the wider social group. And as we explore these values, we can see how they can be extended to very distant others. So the ethics of care is not just an ethical approach for contexts of family and friends. The values that we can recognize in these small contexts can be extended globally. As Hume observed, the happiness and misery of others are not spectacles entirely indifferent to us. We care about others to some small extent to start with, and the ethics of care can show us how to increase those understandings of values. The values of care have vast implications for political and economic activities and institutions and can be extended to a global context. Mothering, taking care of children, caring for the ill and elderly had not been considered relevant to moral theory. But as feminists started attending to these caring practices, they could see that they were extremely relevant. And soon after the philosophical beginnings of the ethics of care emerged, the psychological findings of Carol Gilligan and her colleagues solidified the contrast between the traditional moral theories and the values of care, and they formulated the contrast as a contrast between justice and care. So justice can be used to characterize traditional moral theories, not just political theories, in contrast with moral approaches of care. So Gilligan's findings solidified the contrast. Gilligan delineated the two perspectives of justice and care and identified them with a tendency of men to adopt the justice perspective and a tendency of at least some women to adopt a care perspective. Gilligan outlined these perspectives as alternative ways to interpret a moral problem. You can see the moral problem from the perspective of justice or see it from the perspective of care, and it looks different depending on your perspective. And I may have contributed to the solidification of the contrast between justice and care by publishing a collection of readings called Justice and Care, Essential Readings in Feminist Ethics, and these readings illustrated the contrasting approaches. Well, as the perspectives have evolved, we can say that from the perspective of justice, one looks for universal rules to apply to particular cases. One considers fairness and the rights and obligations of all. One assumes each person involved to be a free and equal agent. In contrast, from the perspective of care, one attends with sensitivity to particular others in actual historical circumstances. One seeks a satisfactory relation between oneself and these others. One cultivates trust. One responds to needs, aiming at and bringing about as best one can the well-being of the others along with that of oneself. Although they can perhaps be understood most clearly in the personal contexts of family and friends, the values of care are not limited to these. They are values for fellow members of one's community, one's society, and for very distant others around the globe. Values, after all, are can be conceptualized universally, not just in particular contexts. The perspective of justice conceptualizes persons as autonomous individuals. That of care sees persons as relational. Where justice assumes persons to be independent, care understands that instead of being Hobbesian or Lockean or Kantian individuals, we all start out as helpless infants. Without the care that incorporates very different values than those of the dominant moral theories, we would not have survived, and we continue to be interdependent with others for the rest of our lives, embedded in social relations. And these understandings can be recognized whatever one's culture. Although they have important differences, the dominant moral theories of Kantian ethics and utilitarianism are rationalistic moral theories, theories of justice. The newly explored outlook of care can be developed as an alternative moral theory, the ethics of care. The dominant moral theories are based on rational foundations claimed to be universal, and they are more suited to widespread acceptance than are many of the varied customs of different traditional social groups and cultures. But the ethics of care really is based on experience that is universal. The ethics of care primarily is based on experience, and it's experience that really is universal. The experience of having been cared for, without which we would not exist, and the experience of caring. We have all experienced care. We can recognize the values involved, so the ethics of care is especially suited for cross-cultural discourse and interaction. And as I'm going to reiterate later, one of the strengths of the ethics of care is that it does not it is not based on and does not require religious foundations, which are so often divisive and so often unpersuasive to those who don't share those particular religious foundations. So the ethics of care is based on experience. It's experience that really is universal. Not everybody has been engaged in providing much care, but everybody has received a great deal of care or they would not be here. I think it's clear that we need both justice and care as outlooks and perspectives, as values of practices and institutions. I think we do need to call on the principles of justice to champion rights, demand equality, and clarify fairness in their appropriate domains. But unlike those who think traditional moral theories of justice can be revised to handle all our moral concerns, including care, I think care and its related moral theory are essential. So the question is still how to integrate care and justice. Daniel Engster argues that an adequate theory of justice should include adequate attention to care. And that's one view that has received a certain amount of attention, that care is terribly important. It's got to be included among the things that justice concerns itself with. Yes, I agree, but the title of Engster's book is The Heart of Justice, and this captures well that idea, that care is important, justice has to deal with it. Care, he thinks, is the most important part of justice because without care, no one would even live, let alone live well. There would be no individual liberty or equality, community values, or good life, he writes, without the caring practices necessary to sustain and foster human life and society. End of quote. So, justice should assure that everyone gets the necessary minimums of care. Engster argues that caring should be placed at the center of a public conception of justice and applied to the basic institutions and policies of society so that more support and accommodation is provided for care work. Engster's aim is to construct a theory of justice that appropriately includes within it an adequate appreciation of care. And Fiona Robinson, with more of a focus on international affairs, has a similar view. She is not working to devise a new moral theory, an ethics of care, but to see that our existing theories, such as theories of justice and of security, appropriately understand the central importance of care work. She shows how and why such theories should pay attention to such global problems as widespread poverty, the migration of care workers, the deficits of care that exist in so many ways and places. I entirely agree that theories of justice for legal and political institutions and conceptions of security for human beings should show why society and political institutions must take responsibility for providing necessary levels of care for all persons. These should be covered by principles of distributive justice and protected by rights to basic necessities within societies and at the global level. Much of the labor involved in the care that is needed should be paid labor and not left to families and voluntary organizations to struggle with on their own. And much of the care that is needed should be funded or provided by governmental institutions so that care will be adequate and fair. Societies should take responsibility for care, as they should for justice. However, I do not agree that moral theories of justice can adequately cover the concerns of care. I do think we need an alternative moral theory, the ethics of care, and that this outlook must have priority over political theories of justice. The approach of Angster and Robinson and some others seems to me to be applying a theory of justice to the activities of care. Care is essential to us all. If we lack it, we cannot survive or flourish. Of course, practices of fairness should recognize this and apply to it. Everyone should be able to get the care to which they should be recognized as entitled by right. But thinking this doesn't overthrow the gender hierarchy entrenched in our moral theorizing, and this is what I'm trying to do. So I think we need a new moral theory, not just a new application of the dominant justice thinking. And I think moral theory should have priority over political theory, the way it should have if one's theory were a theory of justice. Normative moral theory is the most general theory aspiring to provide guidance for what we should value and how we should act as human beings in any domain of activity, from the personal to the political. From worker in health care to judge in a courtroom, from parent with a difficult child to friend in a dangerous situation. It aims to be comprehensive. When we act in more limited roles as citizens or legislators or educators or spouses, we should often or also be guided by more restricted and specific norms or recommendations. Since we all, at least to some extent, inhabit these different domains simultaneously, it's difficult to sort out the normative recommendations and descriptions of reality appropriate for us and for them. But this has always been the case. And perhaps it is less problematic from the perspective of care than from more traditional perspectives. It was formerly imagined that conceptual order could be achieved by a radical separation of public and private. In public life, men were to be guided by abstract principles of justice for persons assumed to be free, equal, and self-interested, and self-sufficient. They were to be governed by institutions to which they could consent from an imagined, disinterested position. In the private sphere, in contrast, they were to head households in which their authority would be exercised benevolently without governmental interference. The obvious contradictions between regarding men as considerate of others in the household and motivated by self-interest beyond were just ignored. Contradictions between valuing equality in the public sphere and not valuing it in the family were just overlooked. But the gross deficiencies in the conceptualizations of public and private have been made clear by feminist critiques, and there is by now a widespread recognition that the personal is political, that what happens in political life deeply affects the lives of interdependent women and men in the family, and that the values and realities of private life have profound implications for public political life. So as the distinction between public and private has appropriately broken down, the unsuitability of moral theories constructed for the public sphere, for the context of care, has become quite apparent. Many, perhaps probably most of those who write about care notice how different its ontological commitments need to be. Understanding care leads us to a view of the person as relational and away from the view of the person as independent individual, free, equal, autonomous, self-sufficient adult. The outlook of care understands us as dependent and interdependent. It emphasizes and values caring relations, not just the dispositions of actions of individuals. These views, among others, seem to require a kind of moral theory different from the moral dominant ones. the dominant moral theories are closely aligned with the dominant political theories of the past few centuries. I'm not a historian, and so I won't venture a stand on whether the moral theories led to the political ones or the political ones to the moral. I suspect that the dominant moral theories were reflections of the historical development of Western political, economic, and social institutions and life, but it doesn't really matter which direction the causal influences ran. What matters for us here is that they are compatible. The dominant political theories match and are reflections of the dominant moral theories and vice versa. They're compatible, they're reflections of each other, and that's what we need to pay attention to. Care theory may be a reflection of the growing influence of women in society, but as a moral theorist, I'm trying to evaluate this trend, not just describe it. I think care theory needs to be a new moral theory, not only a new area of application of previous moral and political theory. The ethics of care should then have priority over its political theory, the way the dominant moral theories of justice, if they were satisfactory, should have priority over their associated political theories. But then which moral theory should we accept? Whatever the direction of historical influence, existing political theories of justice reflect existing moral theories of justice and vice versa. Consider how the existing theories of justice not only overlook care, but privilege various segments of society. They privilege the legal and political and ignore others. John Rawls, the enormously influential political philosopher of the last half-century, asserted that, quote, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, end of quote. If you apply this claim to the legal institutions of society, it's quite persuasive, very persuasive. But social institutions include far more than the justice system of the law and its enactments and enforcements. Educational institutions are certainly social institutions, but their first virtue is hardly justice. Of course, they should treat persons fairly, but their priority is to promote the values of learning and education. Opportunities for education should be distributed fairly, yes, but first, such systems of education must be created and must operate. Or consider the social institutions composing the healthcare system. Healthcare should be available to all in ways that are fair. But first, the institutions must be developed. Justice is not and should not be their first concern. They rightly aim, first of all, to promote the values of health, to treat the wounded, cure the ill, and prevent disease, and so on. Actually, in the US, many health institutions aim primarily at making profit. But this is clearly not what their priority ought to be, so they pretend to aim primarily at health. But the first consideration of many areas of society should not be justice, it should be other activities in which they are engaged. Similarly, social services, whether public agencies or private charitable institutions, are social institutions whose aims of providing for the poor and meeting the needs of the afflicted do not have justice as their first concern. Now consider the economy. Although it ought to be vastly more just than it is at present, it's very questionable that it ought to have justice as its first virtue. Before a society can assure a just distribution of its wealth and income, it must have the wealth and income to distribute. So an economy aims at creating goods and services, first of all, and then one can apply the considerations of justice to how the result is distributed. Finally, the family is a social institution monumentally left out of the conception of society that sees justice as the primary value of its institutions. Yes, there should be more fairness in the family than there has traditionally been, but justice should not be the concern it puts above all others. The distinction between public and private, the idea that the public has relevance for moral theory in a way that the private does not, accounts for much of this oversight of the experience of women in moral theorizing. But that distinction is now being dramatically overhauled by feminist rethinking. So we have to wonder whether our conceptions of society, how we think about society, as they have come to us from the dominant moral and political theories, are very much affected by a gender bias that focuses on the activities associated with men and hardly notices those associated with women, such as taking care of children, educating them, and caring for the ill and infirm. Even when men participate in these activities, the activities as a whole are conceptualized as if it were women conducting them. And those domains of society associated with women have had little effect on traditional moral theorizing and do not fit well with traditional moral theory. When we do focus on these other segments of society that have been neglected, we can see that they are and ought to be guided far more by the values of care than by the values of justice. And we can see as an empirical matter that if more resources would be devoted to these undervalued segments of society, the need for the legal activities and enforcements of the segments that play so large a role in dominant theorizing would diminish. For instance, there is much empirical evidence that if care is adequate when persons are young, they will have fewer problems with the law when they are older. To take just one example, there's a great deal of solid evidence that preschool programs more than pay for themselves later in these terms. This is not to say that as the caring activities of a society would expand, government funding would shrink. Public funding is often the best way to carry out the care we all should provide for each other, and to do it in a way that is fair. But the share of that funding devoted to law and its enforcement within society and military force globally could diminish if care as a value were more influential. Arguments that care needs to be socialized rather than to remain entirely the responsibility of families and private charitable or religious institutions are thoroughly persuasive. Care institutions become then to some extent parts of political systems, but care institutions do not become simply yet another part of legal or political systems. To an important extent, they remain, though previously neglected in moral theorizing, in separate domains of society. I'm trying to conceptualize society and its various activities and think of the morality that is appropriate for an overall view of society and persons. If we try to correct for the past neglect of caring practices and values, should we then take care and justice as somehow of equal importance, as women and men should be regarded as equal? This would seem to leave us with Carol Gilligan's unsatisfactory conception of alternative perspectives. As she describes it, we encounter a moral problem, we see how it looks from the different perspectives of justice or care, but then what? Which should we choose to act on? If it's a moral problem, we do not just want to see how it looks from the different points of view, we want to figure out what to do about it. So, should we do what a care perspective would recommend, or what a justice perspective would demand? Thinking of them as equally valid and as applicable to whatever the problem is helps to clarify alternatives, but it does not guide our answers. What I propose is to see the ethics of care as a comprehensive morality within which it can be appropriate to see various ethics of justice as applicable to the limited domains of the legal and political. I take the network of caring relations as the wider domain of society as a whole. Within it are subsystems with their own priorities. This wider domain of society as a whole includes the weaker caring relations of civil society that enable legal and political and other institutions to function. This wider domain includes also the strongest bonds of care in families and among friends. It's composed of relations that are primarily informal, in contrast to the formal relations of legal and to a lesser extent political systems. While legal and political institutions ought themselves to be more caring than they have been, they should still, I think, give priority to justice. But while legal and political institutions should look for moral guidance primarily to moral theories of justice, they should be seen as limited domains within society, not as covering the entire society, although that has been the traditional view. Institutions and persons in the wider domain should look primarily, I think, to the ethics of care. The ethics of care can provide guidance for how we ought to act and live in our roles within the various segments of society, but also, importantly, for how the various segments themselves ought to be developed. What should the relations between them be? Should we, for instance, devote more resources to the military, or to law enforcement, or to education, or to healthcare? In a caring society, the legal system could be expected to shrink. Markets could be expected to be limited, and more attention would be paid to, for instance, education and non-commercial culture. That would be just an example. Saying that in a given domain, a given value should have priority is not to say that other values then become irrelevant. For instance, within the caring relations of the family, though the values of care should have priority, we often need to make room for the values of fairness within the family. Although the relations are primarily caring relations, sometimes they're highly competitive or legal and should look first to justice for guidance in those particular matters. For instance, if siblings engage in a competitive game, say of tennis, then for that limited interaction, fairness should prevail. But the more general considerations between them, even in these cases, should remain those of care. I see legal and political systems as overlapping but distinct. And both are distinct from economic systems, though again, there is large overlap. And these are distinct from the healthcare or education systems of society. Social policies determined by political processes shape the economy, healthcare, education, the family, and much else. Politics and the law can have a large effect on how healthcare or education is handled in a society, as we can often be acutely aware. Nevertheless, politics and the law do not deliver healthcare, the actual work of treating patients or preventing illness. They do not themselves educate children. Law and political institutions greatly affect the economy, but they do not themselves produce most goods and services. All these segments of society are different from the social bonds of families and the informal groupings of friends and voluntary associations. The institution of the family has been changing greatly in recent years, and families can be very different from traditional notions of nuclear and even extended families. Groupings of friends can count as families, yet we can still recognize the family as a fundamental social institution and acknowledge the great importance of families. We can also recognize culture as a domain of societies, segments of societies, regions, composed of several societies, and potentially of global society. Culture reflects and produces images, emotions, ideas, attitudes. It can contribute greatly to social change, to sensitivity toward and understanding of and willingness to take account of unfamiliar others and distant persons. As culture would be produced and guided increasingly by the values of care, prospects would improve for global understanding, nonviolent resolution of conflicts, improved meeting of needs. It's useful and not impossible then to discern these different domains of society, and we can well understand how these different domains should give priority to different values and be guided by moral approaches with different emphases. And all these different domains exist somehow within that of a society as a whole, usually a national one, but potentially a global one, within which social relations must be at least minimally caring, or the society will disintegrate. There's a huge overlap between these various domains. The model here should be that between the legal and the political, which are not easy to distinguish, and yet are not the same. Think, for instance, of social movements. They're very important too, and recognized in political systems. Perhaps, as some claim, you can't have significant change without a social movement. And yet, social movements barely register in legal systems and how they're conceptualized. So that's just one example of how you can separate the legal and political. There's a huge overlap, but still, they are different segments of society. And these other areas similarly can have huge overlap, and yet we can distinguish them and see how they might well emphasize or give priority to different values. Somewhat similarly, the provision of social services is an important function of government, but the welfare system, and even more clearly the healthcare system, can be distinguished from the political system despite their overlap. And the same with education and culture. These different domains of social activity can then be distinguished, and we can consider which values ought to have priority in guiding them. When we are trying to do the right thing, considerations of justice and considerations of care may well conflict. We do not need to choose between them as complete but conflicting outlooks. We should try to see when it would be appropriate to give priority to which. And I think this is entirely reasonable, to sort out in which contexts of society which values should have priority. Then we can see how the ethics of care should be the comprehensive morality guiding them all and the relations between the different domains. When sociologists look at society, they discern such major institutions as the family, the political system, the economic system, the legal system, sport, education, science, the medical system, the military, and so on. These different components of society serve different needs and are guided by different values and norms. So sociologists are accustomed to seeing different segments of society. But sociologists merely describe the values and norms that seem to prevail in different segments, such as the value of a fair trial and the norm of informing suspects of their rights for the legal system, and the value of unbiased search for truth and the norm to conduct research for the institution of science. The intent of sociology is merely to describe the dominant values and norms. The task of moral philosophy, in contrast, is to evaluate them and especially to provide arguments with which to improve them. My arguments aim at recommending the values and norms that ought to guide persons in their different roles in society and to have priority. And it is appropriate, I think, that persons in different roles in different institutions should be guided by different, more particular moral norms and values, and that they should be guided by an overall moral approach, such as the ethics of care, but understand the more particular recommendations within the various spheres. In the widest circle of society as a whole are the contexts of families and friends with their strongest and most lasting caring relations, and also the institutions of civil society with their weak, sometimes transient, yet necessary relations of at least minimal care. For the national state to exist, there must be at least sufficient caring among its members to support state identity. Governmental institutions can in turn support the caring relations of civil society by its programs, for instance, by subsidizing educational and cultural ventures. For legal and political institutions to function, people must care sufficiently that the rights of fellow citizens are respected, that obligations to them are met. They must care enough for the political interests of fellow citizens to accept majority decisions for elections, the politics, the policies of winning parties, and the like. Society as a whole contains the strongest caring relations of families and groups, and the weakest yet important relations of civil society. Both these sorts of relations are largely informal. Located somewhere between these are the formal relations of legal and political systems. In this intermediate region is also the economy, as it would be guided both voluntarily and by governmental requirement, increasingly by the values of care. It would do more to provide what members of society actually need, and would be structured less to provide advantage to the already advantaged. Its relations would more often be caring and cooperative rather than competitive and conflictual. Its markets would be limited rather than ever expanding. In the family, no, stop that. The ethics of care might allow, and I'm talking now still about the economy. The ethics of care might allow within the economy, it might allow and recognize the pursuit of individual gain as legitimate in many of society's economic pursuits, but might promote a vast expansion of caring, cooperative economic activity. And it would surely promote an expansion of culture guided by moral and aesthetic values rather than mere economic growth. The ethics of care would clearly recommend societies and a world in which the values of care would be far more strongly developed and emphasized, and the institutions of law and enforcement and coercive political power decreasingly needed. The ethics of care appreciates the values incorporated into practices of care and understands how they should be extended to the wider society and the globe. Sarah Ruddock focused her attention on the values discernible in practices of parenting and showed how they were highly relevant to promoting peace between societies. Many mothers know, she wrote in a characteristic passage, what many military enthusiasts forget. The ability to destroy can shock and awe, but compelling the will is subtle, ultimately cooperative work. End of quote. Nell Noddings, in her book, Starting at Home, examines the values of caring in the family and shows how they should be extended to social policies. I and others have tried elsewhere to indicate some of the implications of the ethics of care for social institutions and global arrangements. With respect to violence and terrorism, the ethics of care would remind us to focus on what succeeds in reducing violence, rather than letting us be lured into the hasty use of violence ourselves. In caring practices, the temptation to use violence against infuriating children and obnoxious patients are enormous. The temptations are there, but care teaches us to avoid doing so, to avoid using violence, which is not to say to embrace pacifism, but to reduce the use of violence to genuine minimums. We can recognize that conflict will always exist, and that coercion will probably always remain needed in some cases, but we can work far more successfully than we have to greatly reduce coercion and violence in societies and between them. In relations between states, international law has a record of success in reducing violence. In dealing with terrorist groups, we can understand that such groups cannot succeed or even survive without a flow of new recruits. Our efforts are best directed at reducing the appeal of such groups so as to decrease the numbers. Where the aims of a terrorist group are repugnant, potential recruits can be persuaded to reject them. Where the aims are legitimate, as they have been for various groups seeking liberation from colonial domination, better ways than through the use of violence to pursue those aims can be enabled. Terrorism is a weapon of the weak. It is up to those with superior power to make it possible for those with legitimate aims to pursue them through morally better means than violence. The recent examples of Quebec and Scotland might be instructive. Momentous decisions were made through voting rather than through people shooting each other. And some ethnic conflicts or demands for independence aren't quite resolvable as easily, but it is an example to be remembered. In contrast with the dominant moral and political theories that have so deeply affected our outlooks and institutions and behavior, the ethics of care appreciates the values embedded in caring practices. It understands the values of empathy, of responding to needs, of mutuality, of trust. Care is the most fundamental value, since without it none of us would be alive. An experience of care is universal, experienced by every person in every culture. The ethics of care requires no religious foundations. As we reflect on our experience of care, we can see how it offers the hopeful prospect of a more caring society and a more caring world. Thank you so much. Now we have time for questions.
We have ample time for questions, and Andres Bart will lead and facilitate that.
Thank you very much for your beautiful lecture. My name is Andres Bart. I'm one of the conveners of this series of seminars. And we have the opportunity to ask questions to Professor Held. Who of you want to start? Come to you. Please, will you name your name?
Hello, Professor Held. My name is Jason Danley. I'm a professor at Oxford Brookes University in anthropology, and I really found your talk very interesting, very stimulating, and it brought up a lot of questions. And perhaps this is because I'm an anthropologist more than a philosopher, but I found myself trying to grasp for something perhaps a little bit more concrete in your descriptions of care. You gave very vivid pictures of care in this sort of nurturing, mothering, aesthetic sort of mode. but again, as anthropologists, we know that mothering happens in different ways, you know, and sort of has different values and is sort of, you know, has different effects across the world, right? So, so things like that, I keep on wanting to think, especially in your claims of the universality of care, more concretely about care in other places, in other cultures, and also about the sort of conflicts that you mentioned. I did work with caregivers of older adults in Japan, and of course there's these ideations, these thoughts about sometimes very violent things, sometimes suicidal thoughts, sometimes about killing the other person, people that they loved and cared for, but the burden of that care was often very great, right? And taken upon the self, it could be very. So I want to think that yes, care is good, but doesn't it always come with a cost? And then how does that cost or that emotional conflict? How should we think about that? How's that integrated into the ethics of care, I guess?
Well, I think one of the strengths of the ethics of care is that it does not lose sight of the fact that care is work. It involves the activities of caring that are very burdensome. You don't lose sight of that from this perspective in a way that you easily do from the point of view of various moral theories. Some of the cross-cultural values that can be discerned, I think, were suggested by Sarah Reddick's description of mothering. Even though there might be very different practices in different cultures, any practice of mothering is going to recognize that children need food. They need enough to sustain themselves, to grow and develop. So the understanding that care has to include providing food for children to grow in development is going to be universal. It's going to be recognizable anywhere by anyone concerned with bringing up the next generation. And there are a lot of other things like that. You have to try to bring your child up to be more or less adapted to the society, and this could be a matter of very varying degree, but they have to learn some basic elements of what is expected of them and how to behave just to be able to survive in any society. There could be quite significant variations in all those things, but there are going to be some things that are entirely general that you have to bring the children up to be able to make their way. You have to get them to live in the first place, and then to be sufficiently educated in the ways of the culture to be able to make their way in the society. So all these things could be quite general about what any practice of bringing up children is going to include. Now, remind me of your last point.
About the work and the burden, the cost of care.
Well, yes, but that's part of the understanding that it is going to be work. There's going to be a burdensome aspect of it. Yes, everybody can understand that. Oh, about caring for older people, for instance. I think that's a good example of how, in many cases, it's better to have governmental institutions that provide basic care. It's much more fair than having the burden fall on, vastly more fair than having the burden always fall on the daughter-in-law. That sort of practice. It's much more effective to have something. I mean, in advanced societies where there are systems of what?
But certainly that's not a universal opinion. There's many who would argue that care of older parents should be a responsibility that's best provided by the family, with some sort of support and some sort of perhaps leave of the job and other kinds of support or paid support. But
right, but yes, but you can have considerable variations in what people would think is appropriate here. But there are going to be some ways of handling the problem. I thought you were saying that you're going to run into such conflicts that you're not going to be able to handle the problems. I think it's a good example of where justice should play a role, but considerations of care should remain the most important considerations. And there can be very significant variations in how that would be, but I think you can see fairly rapidly that where the burden is distributed to the daughters and daughter-in-laws, that's going to be unfair, and that a better way of doing it would be to make services available so that those who wanted to take care of the old people in the family would be enabled to do that, so that the government role could be primarily one of making services available, making funding available, that kind of thing, not forcing people into nursing homes necessarily. I mean, there could be appropriate degrees of choice involved, and appropriate degrees of social responsibility recognized for dealing with such problems. And then, even though care would be the primary value in dealing with family situations of this kind, you would certainly want to bring in fairness as well.
Okay. We go to the next question.
Hi. Hello, I'm Abril Saldaña from Mexico.
Could you speak a little
Abril Saldaña from Mexico, and my question is regarding domestic workers. I look at domestic workers in Mexico for my PhD, and some of the discourses around domestic work were prioritize some sort of moral of care instead of a approach through justice. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about this International Labour Organization later convention on workers' rights for decent job conditions for domestic workers, and how do we in practice prioritize values of care above justice, and what happened when that discourse or rhetoric seem to silence issues of justice that are underneath, in terms of, for example, approaching domestic workers as if she's one of the family. She doesn't do it for money, but she does it because she cares. So how do we in practice look at these particular issues where a family care is done through a worker that is either a migrant or someone that is racialized and has a class privileged position?
Are you familiar with the collection of essays that, let's see. Well, there's one that, oh, I thought I had it here, but I don't. it would be referred to. Do you know Fiona Robinson's book, The Ethics of Care? The Ethics of Care, A Feminist Approach to Human Security. That's one of them. But then she and somebody else collected a group of essays dealing with the migration of care workers. And in those papers, there was a very excellent discussion, I thought, of how the ethics of care is much more suitable for dealing with that problem than the ethics of justice. Fairness has to come in here, but to recognize the implications and the moral considerations that we have to take into account, the ethics of care is really more suitable. The way migrating care workers have to leave their own families for years at a time, and their ability to give care is not honored, not respected by these vast migrations of care workers from underdeveloped countries to rich countries. And so Eva Kate has a paper on these matters of recognizing that maybe the ability to give care should be some sort of right that is respected and honored. When care workers are hired for institutions in the advanced countries, they deplete the capacities of the underdeveloped countries to have their own nurses and doctors. Somebody who is trained in an underdeveloped country as a nurse can earn a lot more working in a household in the US or Britain. And so it's an extraordinary drain on the less developed countries to have these migrations take place. And yet some governments, like the Philippines, encourage the migration because they depend on the money that's sent home. And it does provide some income for the sending country, but it maybe robs a great many people of their right to give care to their own families, and it depletes the supply of care workers at home at every level. So there's a lot wrong with the migrations of care workers that are now so extensive. And it's a huge problem that there should be a great deal more attention given to.
Does that answer your question?
I may not have quite.
Just one quick question. Why would a approach through care will be better than an approach from justice?
Well, because I think in my argument, the ethics of care is the most general theory. Within that, you should pay attention to issues of justice, yes. Okay. But it would be, you wouldn't lose sight of some of these other aspects of the values involved in care. You would be able to recognize how significant a moral affront it is to have a woman sort of economically forced to leave her own children. Because when you think of it in terms of neoliberal economics, they do it voluntarily, supposedly, and it benefits everybody. It benefits the poor country for gaining some resource, some economic advantage, and it benefits the rich country because the women can have help at home. And so in the neoliberal economic terms, it's all seen as it's fine, it's perfectly fine. Everybody is just doing what they choose, and everybody benefits economically. You just lose sight of the other aspects.
Okay.
Care wouldn't let you lose sight of those. but certainly justice has to enter in.
Okay, thank you very much. We go to the third question.
Hello, my name is Tina Weber from Germany, and you developed this ethical theory around care, and it's supposed to be an alternative to dominant ethical care theories.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding.
Shall I speak louder?
Speak a little louder and a little slower.
Oh, okay. You developed this ethical theory around care, and it is supposed to be an alternative to dominant ethical care theories. And although I'm not a philosopher, I totally agree, and I find this very fascinating, your point of views. And at that very point, I don't really have a question, but a comment, because I am a sociologist. And you made the statement that sociologists merely describe moral behavior. And I don't agree, because we don't only describe, we analyze and interpret. And the empirical research we do, we also connect to theories. And if we're really good, at the end of the day, we also come up with something with suggestions that would, how to handle things better. So we do maybe the same like practical philosophers. Thank you.
Okay, I think I was thinking more of sociologists in the US. And sometimes they excessively make a point to emphasize that they're just describing things and being empirically solid. It might characterize the few that I'm thinking of, but I am not nearly as familiar with the sociological literature as I would like to be. I am very eager to have suggestions of good sociological discussions of these different areas of society and the kind of norms that do prevail or should prevail in these different areas. So if you could write down a few things you think would be helpful to me, I greatly welcome that. I want to read more sociology.
You can see she will do. Okay. But I am a little bit amazed that sociologists can bridge the gap between fact and value. So there is some problem in your statement, but we leave it. I go to the next question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Pia Vogler, Institute of Population Aging. I have a question. You say that the ethics of care does not need religion, and yet this conflict between justice and care sounds very much to this couple of justice and mercy in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where you constantly have debates whether justice is more important than mercy. Mercy is like compassion, and care, it's actually the same virtue. Justice, this opposition of justice and care sounds very much reminds me on these debates between justice and mercy. And just recently in the Catholic Church was a huge synod about family life, where it was really important as well, precisely this conflict between those who advocate for justice and those who advocate for more mercy, or in the way you put it, more care, the care aspect. So I wonder if you somehow see that care is a continuation of an older concept, or for some still very valued concept of mercy and compassion. Does it relate, or is it for you, do you see I see that there is a relation, but I don't know if this is as well what you see, or...
I'm not sure I understood quite a bit of what you said.
May I try to summarize the question? What is the relation between care and compassion?
And what?
The relation of care and compassion.
Oh, okay. And mercy. You brought up mercy. So I was going to talk about that a little bit. And I think it's helpful to go back to a core activity of care, which is bringing up children. And it does not seem correct to me to think of that in terms of mercy or compassion, because mercy and compassion emphasize altruism, as if there's a conflict between my interests and the other's interests, and that's the wrong way to conceptualize the context. The interest of the parent is not in conflict with the interest of the child. The parent wants the child to do well together with the parent, and similarly, from the perspective of the person being a recipient of care, it should not be, in the case of good care, it should not be a conflictual situation. Some caregivers are selfish, especially if it's just a job and they don't care and they just want to do the minimal of what they have to do to get their paycheck. That could happen, but that's not good care. In the case of good care, it's not a conflict of interest situation, or it shouldn't be interpreted in terms of a zero-sum kind of conflict where one's gain is the other's loss. They are mutually striving to have the child grow up well. In the case of the patient, to have the patient recover. The nurse wants the patient to recover, the patient wants to recover, and they are in it together. So they share various objectives, various interests, and it shouldn't require something like mercy, compassion, altruism. It might require a lot of work, but
Thank you. I go to the next question.
I don't think. No.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Michael Dunn. I work in medical ethics here in the university. I would like to also push a little bit like the first question on the phenomenon of care that drives much of your theorizing. I took it from your response to the first question and in the talk generally that there's many acts of support that are conducive to human survival and development that you want to count as care. Basic things such as putting water on the table or food on the table, as you mentioned. Just by way of personal anecdote, so I come from a very traditional British nuclear family. My mother took care of my sister and I. She was at home looking after us. My father went to work. We saw very little of him. He was a civil servant. But his actions were fundamentally conducive to our survival, to our development in the family. And he would classically say, I'm working so hard because I'm taking care of you and your sister. Now it seems like both of those kinds of activities, whilst very different, are both different kinds of caring activities on the account you gave. But I take it you'd also want to differentially evaluate in moral terms the kinds of activities that are taking place, namely going to work, working as a civil servant, etc., versus the interpersonal dimensions of personal support that my mother gave me. So I wondered how you could just square that particular circle.
I'm sorry, but I didn't quite get the question at the end of your discussion.
Sure, so I'm interested to know how, if all of these things might count as acts of care, why we would emphasize or evaluate one particular kind of aspect, namely the relational personal dimensions, differently to what looks like the realm of work, etc.
Well, lots of people work to benefit themselves, to get economically greater advantage than they have. I wouldn't count that as an aspect of care. If you're trying to get rich and you're thinking just of yourself, I wouldn't count that as care. If you are working many hours as needed by your family, yes, that could easily be. A lot would depend on the motive here and the economic structure within which you were having to live your life. So where it's very clearly up to each individual to sort of provide for their own resources, it might be a somewhat individual decision to provide for my family. In more socialized kinds of circumstances, that might be a more shared aspect, providing for us, the community. So you would take part in things that would provide for us, the community. It would be less individualistic. But depending on the appropriate description of what the person is doing, yes, it could be being able to come up with the provision of the food on the table could well be an aspect of care, but it would be quite different from a lot of the work that a lot of people do, which is not primarily directed to providing for their families or their children and that kind of thing. So you would be needing to give a reasonable interpretation of what's going on, and it could very clearly be part of the activity of care to obtain the resources. And this all shows how unsatisfactory a lot of the standard conceptualizations of individuals and their work have been in the dominant moral theories, because they rely to a very unreasonable degree on the myth of the dominant political theories evolving in the modern era. The liberal individual who can somehow provide for himself. Locke had these vivid images of the individual could always go off into unoccupied territory, till the soil, and make property. I mean, create property out of growing things or hunting or whatever. It was a pretty fanciful image in the 17th century, but it's ridiculous now because people cannot just provide for themselves. They can't, on their own, come up with the resources that they need, even for themselves, never mind their families. So the images in the background of a lot of political and associated moral theory are that people can somehow just be self-sufficient, provide for themselves. But this is ridiculous. And I think bringing up the need to come up with the resources to feed your family makes that point very well. That for most people, for almost everybody, it means working at some job or other and being extraordinarily interdependent with everybody else.
Professor Held, we have still 2 questions.
Okay.
Before the clock of 2. So the first one.
Hi, my name is Mary Johnstone Louis, and I'm a DPhil student here. I look at the way that care is actually dealt with in context of business and enterprise. Okay. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a DPhil student looking at the way that the economic and business context engages with issues of care. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm very kind of intrigued by the idea that care could be universal in the way that you describe, but I wanted to pick up on kind of this claim that actually it's something that doesn't require broader consensus. I mean, you made the contrast with religion, and
I'm sorry, doesn't require what?
Doesn't require kind of that it's universal, that it's universally an experience we all share, caring or being cared for, and therefore, unlike something like religion, it's not divisive, right? I mean, that's sort of a very crude summary of what I've taken away. And I'm wondering if, I want to believe that that's true. I'm also currently 8 months pregnant, so I think there are sometimes times where there's a conflict of interest between myself and my child. But my broader question is mothering the right place to situate this discussion if you want it to have universal appeal? I guess that's my question. And the reason I'm asking that is particularly because in business and management context now, particularly in the West, dealing with aging populations is becoming a care issue even more critical than childcare. And so I'm wondering, is the focus on mothering rather than care for the elderly really the most universal place to situate this discourse?
Well, I think so, because it's quite easy to say we have all experienced care or we wouldn't be here, but that was child care. Issues about how to care for the elderly are much more divisive, and one can have future generations even within this enormous diversity of caring for the elderly or not caring for them. I mean, for humanity to continue, you have to have childcare, but you could kill off the old people or whatever. That could be a subject of enormous diversity, you could fail to have agreement on that and still recognize that to have humanity continue, we've got to have childcare. So I think that would be a much better place to look for the universal aspects of care and to look for values that would be capable of being universalized.
So doesn't that bring you back to self-interest, right? That caring for children is simply perpetuating your own future benefit. Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas the care for the elderly, absolutely, there's no clear future benefit as far as we can imagine. It only exists under a framework of care. That's the question I was trying to explain. Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry. I must have not understood.
Okay. Perhaps we should postpone this discussion and take it up another moment. I go to the last question. Excuse me, I want to ask.
Hello, my name's Julie Winthrop. I work at the University of Southampton. And I'm an academic, but I'm also a health professional. Sorry. And what I'd like to ask you about, we've seen this language of compassion become a big part of healthcare business. We've seen particularly talk of the failure of compassion, most often related to the female part of the workforce. I don't know if this is familiar to you. Post the Francis report, we've had this, very particular failure in care. And what I find it really helpful, your delineation between the shared interests and the competing interests, because our health workforce is very definitely being set up as having competing interests, in my view. And what I'd like to ask you about is where care meets power, because the powerful people are talking about incentivizing compassion, and the caring workforce are running themselves ragged trying to be more compassionate without very much power. So I suppose my question is, what happens with how powerful is the ethics of care?
A beautiful last question. Care meeting power.
I'm still feeling badly that I didn't understand the previous question, and I didn't address that. So if you mean that context of teaching or something like that would be just as good as mothering, well, maybe. The more context, the better. We shouldn't have a conflict here. We ought to be trying to learn from each other. For instance, if there are variations in methods of childcare, we should be able to learn from each other, and as a result of reflection and discussion and argument, we can come up with views of which kinds of care are better, what constitutes good care, in what sorts of contexts and situations. So moral inquiry proceeds by discussion, argument, disagreement, and evolving better views. So any context of care would be helpful, but it might, you might lose some arguments if you're trying to generalize from something that would be better understood in a different context, and so on. I don't know if that gets to the question either, because I'm having a little trouble hearing the people in the back.
If I may add something.
But now, about compassion and power. Clearly, power matters in society and in political decisions and the way society organizes itself and devotes its resources. If you had a society that could be characterized as a caring society, you would apply appropriate values and expend resources in a way that could be compatible with what care would require. You wouldn't have it be determined so much by who has the economic power and can afford the good care. It would be both more just and also more caring. But if you're saying how much effect can the ethics of care have, the ethics of care as a moral theory might, we could hope, be a little more effective than some other kinds of ethics because it appeals to the emotions. It can motivate in a way that rationalistic theories may have more trouble motivating. People could recognize the truth of an abstract statement. Yes, they have some, they can recognize the truth of a Kantian injunction without doing anything about it. If you are moved by the ethics of care, you are more apt to be emotionally involved in wanting to act accordingly. But in a way, we're in the same boat as any other moral theory. We're trying to give suggestions to what people ought to do if they want to do what they ought. If they don't want to do what they ought, it's a little bit hard to reach them.
Thank you. So, and on that note, thank you so much, Professor Held. So, and on that note of the emotions, so next week, Fabienne Brugère from the University of Paris will be here, and her topic is emotions as constituents of care. So hopefully we'll address the issue of compassion and emotions much more. Again, thank you very much, Professor Held, for a very fascinating lecture.